Section 14 of Divots by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Purification of Rodney Spelvin, Part 1. It was an afternoon on which one would have said that all nature smiled. The air was soft and balmy. The links, fresh from the rains of spring, glistened in the pleasant sunshine. And down on the second tee young Clifford Wimple, in a new suit of +4s, had just sunk 2 balls in the lake, and was about to sink a third. No element, in short, was lacking that might be supposed to make for quiet happiness. And yet on the forehead of the oldest member, as he sat beneath the chestnut tree on the terrace overlooking the 9th green, there was a peevish frown, and his eye, gazing down at the rolling expanse of turf, lacked its customary genial benevolence. His favourite chair, consecrated to his private and personal use by unwritten law, had been occupied by another. That is the worst of a free country. Liberty so often degenerates into license. The oldest member coughed. "I trust," he said, "you find that chair comfortable?" The intruder, who was the club's hitherto spotless secretary, glanced up in a goofy manner. "Eh? That chair. You find it fit snugly to the figure?" "Chair? Figure? Oh, you mean this chair? Oh, yes. I am gratified and relieved," said the oldest member. There was a silence. "Look here," said the secretary, "what would you do in a case like this? You know I'm engaged." "I do, and no doubt your fiancée is missing you. Why not go in search of her? She's the sweetest girl on earth. I should lose no time. But jealous, and just now I was in my office, and that Mrs. Pettigrew came in to ask if there was any news of the purse which she had lost a couple of days ago. It had just been brought to my office, so I produced it, whereupon the infernal woman, in a most unsuitably girlish manner, flung her arms around my neck and kissed me on my bald spot. And at that moment Adela came in. 'Death,' said the secretary, 'where is thy sting?' The oldest member's pique melted. He had a feeling heart. 'Most unfortunate. What did you say?' 'I hadn't time to say anything. She shot out too quick.' The oldest member clicked his tongue sympathetically. 'These misunderstandings between young and ardent hearts are very frequent,' he said. 'I could tell you at least 50 cases of the same kind. The one which I will select is the story of Jane Packard, William Bates, and Rodney Spelvin. You told me that the other day. Jane Packard got engaged to Rodney Spelvin, the poet, but the madness passed and she married William Bates, who was a golfer. This is another story of the trio. You told me that one, too. After Jane Packard married William Bates, she fell once more under the spell of Spelvin, but repented in time. This is still another story, making 3 in all." The secretary buried his face in his hands. "Oh, well," he said, "go ahead. What does anything matter now?" "First," said the oldest member, "let's make ourselves comfortable. Take this chair. It's easier than the one in which you're sitting." "No, thanks." "I insist." "Oh, all right." "Oof," said the oldest member, settling himself luxuriously. With an eye now full of kindly goodwill, he watched young Clifford Wimple play his fourth. Then, as the silver drops flashed up into the sun, he nodded approvingly and began. "The story which I am about to relate," said the oldest member, "begins at a time when Jane and William had been married some 7 years. Jane's handicap was 11, William's 12, and their little son Braid Varden had just celebrated his 6th birthday. Ever since that dreadful time, 2 years before, when, lured by the glamour of Rodney Spelvin, she had taken a studio in the artistic quarter, dropped her golf, and practically learned to play the ukulele, Jane had been unremitting in her efforts to be a good mother and to bring up her son on the strictest principles. And, in order that his growing mind might have every chance, she had invited William's younger sister, Anastasia, to spend a week or 2 with them and put the child right on the true functions of the mashie. for Anastasia had reached the semi-finals of the last Ladies' Open Championship, and, unlike many excellent players, had the knack of teaching. On the evening on which this story opens, the two women were sitting in the drawing-room chatting. They had finished tea, and Anastasia said, with the aid of a lump of sugar, a spoon, and some crumbled cake, was illustrating the method by which she had got out of the rough on the 5th at Squashy Hollow. "You're wonderful," said Jane admiringly. "And such a good influence for Braid. You'll give him his lesson tomorrow afternoon as usual?" "I shall have to make it in the morning," said Anastasia. "I've promised to meet a man in town in the afternoon." As she spoke, there came into her face a look so soft and dreamy that it aroused Jane as if a bradawl had been driven into her leg. As her history has already shown, there was a strong streak of romance in Jane Bates. "Who is he?" she asked excitedly. "A man I met last summer," said Anastasia. And she sighed with such abandon that Jane could no longer hold in check her womanly nosiness. "Do you love him?" she cried. "Like bricks," whispered Anastasia. "Does he love you?" "Sometimes I think so." "What's his name?" "Rodney Spelvin." "What?" "Oh, I know he writes the most awful bilge," said Anastasia, defensively, misinterpreting the yowl of horror which had proceeded from Jane. "All the same, he's a darling." Jane could not speak. She stared at her sister-in-law aghast. Although she knew that if you put a driver in her hands she could pace the ball into the next county, there always seemed to her something fragile and helpless about Anastasia. William's sister was one of those small, rose-leaf girls with big blue eyes, to whom good men instinctively want to give a stroke a hole, and on whom bad men automatically prey. And when Jane reflected that Rodney Spelvin had to all intents and purposes preyed upon herself, who stood 5'7" in her shoes, and, but for an innate love of animals, could have felled an ox with a blow, she shuddered at the thought of how he would prey on this innocent half-portion. "You really love him?" she quavered. "If he beckoned to me in the middle of a medal round, I would come to him," said Anastasia. Jane realized that further words were useless. A sickening sense of helplessness obsessed her. Something ought to be done about this terrible thing, but what could she do? She was so ashamed of her past madness that not even to warn this girl could she reveal that she had once been engaged to Rodney Spelvin herself, that he had recited poetry on the green while she was putting, and that later he had hypnotized her into taking William and little Braid to live in a studio full of samovars. These revelations would no doubt open Anastasia's eyes, but she could not make them. And then, suddenly, fate pointed out a way. It was Jane's practice to go twice a week to the cinema palace in the village, and 2 nights later she set forth as usual, and took her place just as the entertainment was about to begin. At first she was only mildly interested. The title of the picture, Tried in the Furnace, had suggested nothing to her. Being a regular patron of the silver screen, she knew that it might quite easily turn out to be an educational film on the subject of clinker coal. But as the action began to develop, she found herself leaning forward in her seat, blindly crushing a caramel between her fingers. For scarcely had the operator started to turn the crank when inspiration came to her. Of the main plot of Tried in the Furnace she retained, when finally she reeled out into the open air, only a confused recollection. It had something to do with money not bringing happiness, or happiness not bringing money, she could not remember which. But the part which remained graven upon her mind was the bit where Gloria Gooch goes by night to the apartments of the libertine, to beg him to spare her sister, whom he has entangled in his toils. Jane saw her duty clearly. She must go to Rodney Spelvin and conjure him by the memory of their ancient love to spare Anastasia. It was not the easiest of tasks to put this scheme into operation. Gloria Gooch, being married to a scholarly man who spent nearly all his time in a library 100 yards long, had been fortunately situated in the matter of paying visits to libertines, but for Jane the job was more difficult. William expected her to play a couple of rounds with him in the morning and another in the afternoon, which cut into her time. However, fate was still on her side, for one morning at breakfast William announced that business called him to town. "Why don't you come too?" he said. Jane started. No, I don't think I will, thanks." "Give you lunch somewhere." "No, I want to stay here and do some practice putting." "All right. I'll try to get back in time for a round in the evening." Remorse gnawed at Jane's vitals. She had never deceived William before. She kissed him with even more than her usual fondness when he left to catch the 10:45. She waved to him until he was out of sight, then, bounding back into the house, leaped at the telephone, and after a series of conversations with the Marks Morris glue factory, the Poor Pussy Home for Indigent Cats, and Messrs. Oakes and Padbury, dealers in fancy goods, at last found herself in communication with Rodney Spelvin. "Rodney," she said, and held her breath, fearful that this breaking of a 2 years' silence, and yet loath to hear another strange voice say, "What num's yer want?" "Is that you, Rodney?" "Yes. Who is that?" "Mrs. Bates. Rodney, can you give me lunch at the Alcazar today at 1? "Can I?" Not even the fact that some unknown basso had got on the wire and was asking if that Mr. Boodle would blur the enthusiasm in his voice. "I should say so." 1 o'clock, then," said Jane. His enthusiastic response had relieved her. If by merely speaking she could stir him so, to bend him to her will when they met face to face would be pie. 1 o'clock, said Rodney. Jane hung up the receiver and went to her room to try on hats. The impression came to Jane, when she entered the lobby of the restaurant and saw him waiting, that Rodney Spelvin looked somehow different from the Rodney she remembered. His handsome face had a deeper and more thoughtful expression, as if he had been through some ennobling experience. "Well, here I am," she said, going to him and affecting a jauntiness which she did not feel. He looked at her, and there was in his eyes that unmistakable goggle which comes to men suddenly, addressed in a public spot by women whom, to the best of their recollection, they do not know from Eve. "How are you?" he said. He seemed to pull himself together. "You're looking splendid." "You are looking fine," said Jane. "You're looking awfully well," said Rodney. "You're looking awfully well," said Jane. "You're looking fine," said Rodney. There was a pause. "You'll excuse my glancing at my watch," said Rodney. "I have an appointment to lunch with somebody here, and it's past the time." "But you're lunching with me," said Jane, puzzled. "Yes, I rang you up this morning." Rodney gaped. "Was it you who phoned? I thought you said Miss Bates." "No, Mrs. Bates." "Mrs. Bates?" "Mrs. Bates." "Of course, you're Mrs. Bates." "Had you forgotten me?" said Jane, in spite of herself a little piqued. "Forgotten you, dear lady, as if I could," said Rodney, with a return of his old manner. "Well, shall we go in and have lunch?" "All right," said Jane. She felt embarrassed and ill at ease. The fact that Rodney had obviously succeeded in remembering her only after the effort of a lifetime seemed to her to fling a spanner into the machinery of her plans at the very outset. It was going to be difficult, she realized, to conjure him by the memory of their ancient love to spare Anastasia, for the whole essence of the idea of conjuring anyone by the memory of their ancient love is that the party of the second part should be aware that there ever was such a thing. At the luncheon table conversation proceeded fitfully. Rodney said that this morning he could have sworn it was going to rain, and Jane said she had thought so too, and Rodney said that now it looked as if the weather might hold up, and Jane said yes, didn't it? And Rodney said he hoped the weather would hold up because rain was such a nuisance, and Jane said yes, wasn't it? Rodney said yesterday had been a nice day, and Jane said yes, and Rodney said that it seemed to be getting a little warmer, and Jane said yes, and Rodney said that summer would be here at any moment now, and Jane said yes, wouldn't it? And Rodney said he hoped it would not be too hot this summer, but that, as a matter of fact, when you come right down to it, what one minded was not so much the heat as the humidity, and Jane said yes, didn't one? In short, by the time they rose and left the restaurant, not a word had been spoken that could have provoked the censure of the sternest critic. Yet William Bates, catching sight of them as they passed down the aisle, started as if he had been struck by lightning. He had happened to find himself near the Alcazar at lunch-time and had dropped in for a chop, and peering around the pillar which had hidden his table from theirs, he stared after them with saucer-like eyes. "Dash it," said William. This William Bates, I have indicated in my previous references to him, was not an abnormally emotional or temperamental man. Built physically on the lines of a motor lorry, he had much of that vehicle's placid and even phlegmatic outlook on life. Few things had the power to ruffle William, but unfortunately it so happened that one of these things was Rodney Spelvin. He had never been able entirely to overcome his jealousy of this man. It had been Rodney who had come within an ace of scooping Jane from him in the days when she had been Miss Packard. It had been Rodney who had temporarily broken up his home some years later by persuading Jane to become a member of the artistic set. And now, unless his eyes jolly well deceived him, this human gumboil was once more busy on his dastardly work. Too dashed thick was William's view of the matter, and he gnashed his teeth in such a spasm of resentful fury that a man lunching at the next table told the waiter to switch off the electric fan, as it had begun to creak unendurably. Jane was reading in the drawing-room when William reached home that night. "Had a nice day?" asked William. "Quite nice," said Jane. "Play golf?" asked William. "Just practiced," said Jane. "Lunch at the club?" "Yes." "I thought I saw that bloke Spelvin in town," said William. Jane wrinkled her forehead. "Spelvin? Oh, you mean Rodney Spelvin. Did you? I see he's got a new book coming out. You never run into him these days, do you?" "Oh, no. It must be 2 years since I saw him." "Oh," said William. "Well, I'll be going upstairs and dressing." It seemed to Jane, as the door closed, that she heard a curious clicking noise, and she wondered for a moment if little Braid had got out of bed and was playing with the mahjong counters. But it was only William gnashing his teeth. There's nothing sadder in this life than the spectacle of a husband and wife with practically identical handicaps drifting apart, and to dwell unnecessarily on such a spectacle is, to my mind, ghoulish. It is not my purpose, therefore, to weary you with a detailed description of the hourly widening of the breach between this once ideally united pair. Suffice it to say that within a few days of the conversation just related, the entire atmosphere of this happy home had completely altered. On the Tuesday, William had excused himself from the morning round on the plea that he had promised Peter Willard a match, and Jane said, "What a pity!" On Tuesday afternoon William said that his head ached, and Jane said, "Isn't that too bad?" On Wednesday morning William said he had lumbago, and Jane, her sensitive feelings now deeply wounded, said, "Oh, had he?" After that, it came to be agreed between them by silent compact that they should play together no more. Also, they began to avoid one another in the house. Jane would sit in the drawing-room, while William retired down the passage to his den. In short, if you had added a couple of icons and a photograph of Trotsky, you would have had a mise-en-scène which would have fitted a Russian novel like the paper on the wall. One evening, about a week after the beginning of this tragic state of affairs, Jane was sitting in the drawing-room, trying to read to Braid on Taking Turf. But the print seemed blurred, and the philosophy too metaphysical to be grasped. She laid the book down and stared sadly before her. Every moment of these black days had affected Jane like a stymie on the last green. She could not understand how it was that William should have come to suspect, but that he did suspect was plain, and she writhed on the horns of a dilemma. All she had to do to win him back again was to go to him and tell him of Anastasia's fatal entanglement. But what would happen then? Undoubtedly he would feel it his duty as a brother to warn the girl against Rodney Spelvin, and Jane instinctively knew that William warning anyone against Rodney Spelvin would sound like a private of the line giving his candid opinion of the sergeant major. Inevitably, in this case, Anastasia, a spirited girl and deeply in love, would take offense at his words and leave the house. And if she left the house, what would be the effect on little Braid's mashie play? Already, in less than a fortnight, the gifted girl had taught him more about the chip shot from 10 to 15 yards off the green than the local pro had been able to do in 2 years. Her departure would be absolutely disastrous. What it amounted to was that she must sacrifice her husband's happiness or her child's future, and the problem of which was to get the loser's end was becoming daily more insoluble. End of section 14.